Welcome everybody to the One Voice COVID-19 podcast webinar. This is Paul Nathanson with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. This is our 12th webinar. Time flies when you're having fun. And obviously we're brought to you by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. I'm pulling up my slides went away for a sec, sorry. Caitlin's not gonna let me do this again. Anyway, as always, as I said, this is Paul Nathanson. I'm here with my colleague, Caitlin Sickles from the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. And as always, we're joined by the Franklin Partnership, Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik, who you'll hear from in a moment. I wanted to remind folks that these webinars are available on our onevoiceinfo.org COVID resource page, where you'll find lots of information on state openings and federal guidelines, including from OSHA, CDC guidance. So there's a whole bunch of information that we really encourage you to go on there. And as always, these webinars are recorded and put up there. Also, under the resources and under the webinars, we've also added the Bracewell OSHA webinar that we discussed a couple weeks ago that has some great guidance from Bracewell lawyers regarding OSHA guidelines and how to make sure that you stay out of trouble with OSHA. And with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleagues from the Franklin Partnership.
Thanks, Paul. This is John Guzik. We're going to talk today a little bit about some OSHA news that has come out this week, some requirements about a written safety plan, and some frequently asked questions regarding the use of face masks. The EEOC issued some frequently asked questions, and additional guidance is there. We're going to update you on some changes at the Main Street Lending Program and the Emergency Industry Disaster Loan Program, also known as EIDL. And of course, we're going to update you on what has happened so far with regard to the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP, update you on that, the legislative correction that Congress addressed. But we're also going to talk about the phase 4, what the next stimulus package is going to look like. So let's start with OSHA, and this is thanks to the webinar that the Bracewell team put together. But OSHA made a requirement that every employer must put together a written plan. They're calling it the Infectious Disease Preparedness and Response Plan. Over the past several webinars, we have been talking to you about the need to do a hazard assessment in your facility. We have suggested that you come up with a plan to stagger start time and end time so that everybody's not coming in at the same time. We've made recommendations to come up with a plan of how you're going to deal with visitors and deliveries into your facility. We've talked to you about the need to come up with a plan of how often you're going to clean your equipment and tools during a specific shift and in between specific shifts. And we've also talked about, what are you going to do if an incident occurs in the workplace, and how are you going to handle it? Basically, if you've been putting together those plans over the past 3 or 4 weeks that we've been talking about these issues, putting together this written plan that is now required by OSHA is going to be easy. And so all employers are required to prepare that plan and not only have it in writing, but share it with their employees. They also gave some additional guidance, Omar, on the use of face masks moving forward.
They did, and we'll just do it quickly here for you all folks. You can take a look at the link down below. We'll get you more information on face mask and cloth coverings and the difference between PPEs and whether they are or they're not. This was just released a couple of days ago, so that's the only reason we're putting it up here. It's a couple of updates here, particularly as many of the states are increasingly requiring of employers that they do hand out and require their employees to wear face masks. This is from the federal government. Again, the feds aren't requiring it. You still have to look at your state, but they are taking a look at it. But what we wanted to point out here, cloth face coverings are still not a substitute for social distancing measures. And that's one of the OSHA guidance that follows a lot of what we've seen from CDC before. And again, just pointing out another FAQ answer here, are employers required to provide cloth face coverings to workers? So the way that they're looking at it, again, we're not lawyers, but the cloth face covering is not considered a PPE. So for the purposes of meeting that safety requirements, that face covering is not going to be considered in that category. So under the general duty clause, they do say that they can include both a combination of safe work practices like social distancing and PPE on top of the face coverings. So they still want you to do the administrative and engineering controls that we talked about maybe about a month ago or so. So again, even if you're doing the face covering, that is not considered a PPE, even if it is being required from a cloth face covering perspective on that standpoint. And then one that just came out yesterday, I believe it was, on the 11th yesterday, from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This is just in case that this is going to start coming up with some of your companies, some of your employees. This slide and the next one just quickly on EEOC issues. This came up in the context of you have somebody that meets the category or the definition of a disability in your household, and therefore you don't want to potentially expose them to COVID-19 by reporting to work, and telework isn't an option there. And so they say that no, you cannot telework because of fear of bringing COVID home. So that is under the ADA. So that's something just to send along to your HR folks, and you can take a look down at the below. So you can, there's quite a few. They updated about a dozen or so questions. They're pretty helpful in that they will put the date it was updated, so you do not have to go through all the different questions that are there. You'll see June 11th, 2020. And this is the issue with regards to age. If somebody that says, okay, the CDC is telling me I'm in a high risk category because I'm over 65, therefore you have to make an accommodation for me. The answer to that is no. The EEOC says that you do not have to make a reasonable accommodation for older workers due to age, even in the COVID environment. So that's, again, another item to send over to your HR folks. But John, a couple of the big things as we switch over here to the lending. We'll get to EIDL, the EIDL, in a second, but we did have some good changes over at the Main Street Lending Facility earlier this week on June 8th.
Yeah, and just to remind everybody, the Main Street Lending Program is a program run out of the Federal Reserve. Initially, the loan term was supposed to be a 4-year loan. They've extended it to 5 years. They made these loans more accessible to small businesses. And with regard to extending the loan terms, they've also changed the repayment. The principal does not need to be repaid for the first 2 years. After that, you'll pay 15% in year 3, 15% in year 4, and 70% of the principal in year 5. Interest is delayed 1 year. But most importantly, they've reduced the loan amount. It used to be a starting point at $500,000. They've now reduced the loan amount, the starting loan amount, from $250,000 to $35 million in the new loan program, and in the priority loan program, it's gone from $250,000 to $50 million. So those are just a couple changes that we hope folks, on this webinar and on this call will take a look at that. As the first choice that our members have looked at was the PPP program. We already know from the survey data that 91% of you have utilized it. We've also heard from the survey data that you are looking for additional assistance, and that is why looking at the Main Street Lending Program is something that you should be looking at, but also the EIDL program moving forward.
That's right, John. And again, reminder for this one, Main Street Lending Facility, there's 2 types of main loans that you're going to be looking at for our members, new loan facility and the priority loan facility. Those are our 2 categories that we'd be looking at. You need to contact your lender to see if they'll be participating. It's not technically open yet, but they literally are expecting it any day. And that's what Powell said just a couple of days ago as well. So we should hopefully be now seeing it sometime in the next week or so come open. But John also mentioned the EIDL program, the emergency injury disaster loans, also coming out of the Small Business Administration. We do have a number of our members that did secure an EIDL loan, or they might be in the process of refinancing it into a 3P, which is permitted. Just going to give you a quick status update on where we are on that. We're at roughly about $80 billion spent down out of the $350 billion that they upped it to over the 2 different tranches that were included. They, as you all recall, and John's mentioned previously, they had pivoted this loan pretty quickly after just a couple of weeks into agriculture only. At this point, it does still seem to be agriculture only, although John and I were watching the hearing in the Senate Small Business Committee on Wednesday, and the SBA administrator indicated that by the end of next week, they're going to have all EIDL loans moved over into the processing stage. So what they've got is 2 different stages over in the EIDL portal. One of them is with regards to when you've submitted it, and that just starts accepting to make sure you've got all the information there. And then the second tranche, you move into the processing stage, and then you'll get into approval. So now that they say all of the pending loans will be moved into the processing stage, we hopefully will start to see the EIDL pick back up and get a little bit more simplified for those companies that wanted to use the EIDL over the 3P program. But John, speaking of 3P program, here's sort of the latest. This is as of June 6th, the data that we've got broken down by NAICS codes.
Yeah, and so it's broken up in NAICS codes, and you see manufacturing move down to the fourth level at 10% of all loans went to manufacturing. But an interesting thing when you look at it is, while there are fewer loans given to manufacturers, there is a larger percentage of the loans that are going to manufacturing. So I just thought that was something to point out. But where are we on the PPP program right now? I think at the last webinar 2 weeks ago, we talked about the tweaking of the PPP program that the House passed. It passed full 117 to 1. We initially anticipated the Senate making some changes on the PPP program, and that would delay the implementation of those particular fixes. But due to negotiations between the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, the Senate passed it with unanimous consent, and the President signed it on June 5th. So what are those changes? They've extended the loan period from 8 to 24 weeks. What does that mean? If you've already been approved for a loan, you can elect to have your loan period between be 8 weeks or 24 weeks. The concern we heard from many manufacturers was a 75-25 ratio, where 75% of the loan must be spent on for payroll costs. That has been reduced to 60%, 60-40. If you're not able to meet the 60% threshold for payroll, your loan forgiveness will be reduced. They announced in the bill that June 30th is the deadline to apply for any new future PPP program loans, and they've extended the deadline from June 30th to December 31st to rehire your employees. Those loans that were issued prior to June 5th, which is the day the President signed the bill, there's a 2-year term on the loan unless your lender chooses to extend the term of the loan. Those loans approved after June 5th will have a 5-year term. And there's also a clarification providing some specific safe harbors. For example, if you're unable to fill your full-time, your FTE, because of the COVID or CDC or HHS or local public health requirements, that you're not able to fulfill your FTE requirements, there's a safe harbor there. There's also another safe harbor for your inability to find the qualified workers, hire workers for the jobs that you have available. And then finally, we want to remind you that while you're permitted to defer your payroll taxes as part of the PPP program, it is not a forgiven plan. So right now, while it may be included in some future phase 4 COVID legislation, we do want to remind you that moving forward, you need to start, while your payroll taxes are deferred, you still will have to pay for it.
Yeah, and so I think part of it there is you want to make sure that you're not hit with 2 at once is where we're going with this. So again, your payroll is being deferred till December 31st of 2021. So you're not paying it for this calendar year, but you're still going to be paying it next calendar year as you normally would, and then still have half of this year's due at the end of next year. So we're just trying to tell folks to be a little bit more careful as they're planning that one. A couple of other things that we want to float out here with regards to this, and we want to be clear, there still is not an updated application for forgiveness. So you should not be using the forgiveness application that was out there. And we'll talk about some of the other guidance that we're waiting for, as we're expecting some simplification, some changes there as well. We also want to just go back to what John mentioned about the safe harbor, about returning the FTE count due to government action. For those of you in states that have capacity restrictions, most of you all aren't going to reach your capacity limitation due to the size of your facility and the number of bodies you have in there, but they are in some businesses having an impact. And so, for example, if your local government says you can only be at 25% capacity, I think New Jersey did something along those lines at one point, then that will not count against you as well. So don't just think about it as a CDC guidance or a government shutdown. Also think about it in terms of a local mandate, in terms of what they're doing and the reduction in your headcount and your FTE that's out there as well. So those are some of the things that they're looking at. Also want to talk about we'll get into this more on the guidance in a couple of slides, but John mentioned about the loans already approved may elect the 8 weeks or the 24-week period covered. It's an either or. So what you also want to keep in mind is the employee retention. There's been some confusion and a lot of folks keep going back and forth on whether or not you need to return your employee headcount back up to where it was at your FTE numbers by June 30th was the previous date. When they extended it to December 31st, there's question whether or not they want you to retain and have all your employees back at that number all the way until December 31st. In trading emails with House staffer that wrote part of this bill, he's saying that you need to have your employee retention number returned back to that reference point at the end of your covered period. So meaning at the end of your 8 weeks or at the end of the 24 weeks, that's when they want to, that's at least the intent of when they want to see you returning. Now, again, we're waiting on guidance to see if we can get some clarification from Treasury Department on that. So there's still some question about where you need to have your FTE headcount of where you're going to be at that point as well. So that's something to keep track. But John mentioned forgiveness applications. We did get a new interim final rule from Treasury a couple of days ago. And this is, people have asked us, what is the deadline for us to file our forgiveness application? This is the first time we've seen any kind of deadline. It is within 10 months. If you do not do it within 10 months, then keep in mind that you will now start to have to paying that principal and the interest and so on and so forth. So this is effectively the deadline. However, in testimony the other day, Mnuchin said, do this as quickly as possible and get this thing going. So we also want to make sure that people keep in mind, and I'll turn over to John on some of the next steps here on Treasury, that for some of you that have non-payroll costs during a covered period, such as utilities, make sure you're counting your days properly for the covered period. So let's, for example, not forget, let's say you got your loan on a Wednesday and you count the end of your covered period is not that next Wednesday. It's actually the Tuesday, saying after 56 days. So keep in mind that it's midnight turning into the day will be the deadline. So you don't have exactly 8 weeks to that Wednesday or to that Friday. It would be to 1 day prior. So keep track of your payments so you don't actually inadvertently get outside of the adjusted window that they provided for you. But John, we did get some additional clear guidance from the Treasury Secretary himself at a hearing on Wednesday.
Yeah, this is a somewhat contentious hearing with the Senate Small Business Committee, and Omar and I were both monitoring it, and Secretary Mnuchin and the administrator of the SBA was there. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of the 19-page forgiveness application when you consider how small the original loan application was. And the Secretary Mnuchin has indicated that they're going to be looking at it. He indicated at the hearing that there's already a third party out there that's offering a software program that makes it a simpler process. But Mnuchin did indicate that the Department of Treasury is going to modify that forgiveness application specifically for loans under $2 million. You'll also get an update of the application for loans over $2 million. And as we have mentioned in the past, those loans over $2 million will have additional scrutiny moving forward to avoid, more loans going to the LA Lakers and Ruth's Chris Steakhouse and such. So that is the purpose of the additional scrutiny for those loans over $2 million. And as Omar mentioned, once you spent down your PPP money, the Secretary at the hearing made it clear you really want to apply for that forgiveness right away. Don't wait for the 24-week deadline moving forward. So we're also expecting some additional guidances moving forward, specifically on the forgiveness application as such, but also he was specifically asked at the hearing, those with certain criminal background, people who have some criminal backgrounds are ineligible for the PPP program. In light of what has been happening in this country the last 2 weeks, it was almost like a softball question for Mnuchin, and he said that he would be issuing additional guidance to allow some with some criminal backgrounds to be eligible for PPP moving forward. So we still need clarification on whether to retain the employees, whether you have to retain your employees through December 31st, or is it once you submitted your forgiveness application, whether you can move forward on that. So those are just, and we also have concerns that there may be a revenue test on the certification of need moving forward. And so we are definitely concerned moving forward on issues like that.
Right, and that goes back to the necessary for the continuing operation of the business certification that's on the application that's out there. And I think we're doing pretty well pushing back on that. We've got Ruby on our side saying, no, you don't need to have that addressed. And so I think we should be okay, but there have been some folks, at least on the Senate GOP side, that have been looking back and saying, well, why, if the people didn't have a reduction in revenue, then why are they taking these loans? So we're trying to address that. Before we shift over into next steps on legislation, I think we just pause and take a couple of questions that we've received in here with regards to the 24 weeks and also the June 30th and the December 31st, for example. So we had a couple of questions. If we choose 24 weeks, can we use 100% for salaries to keep the forgiveness simple? That's an excellent question, an interesting strategy. Yes, we don't see anything that would preclude you from being able to do that. What the language in both the law and now in the updated the IFR says is you can use no more than 40% on the payroll costs, on the non-payroll costs that are eligible, and no less than 60% of your eligible payroll costs. So they don't have a minimum with regards to that, to the utilities and all the others that have to be there. So that could potentially be a strategy that you might want to talk through with the CPA to see if it makes sense for on the books that are there. And then now that we have 24 weeks, is another question. Now that we have 24 weeks, is the payroll still capped at 56 days? Where the payroll is effectively capped is at 2.5 months of payroll. So when you submitted your application, if assuming you got your maximum permissible based on the calculations you provided. So that's the numbers. It's basically when you run out of that money. It's not necessarily, they didn't necessarily calculate it at the 56 days, 8 weeks. When you look at it, it really lasted you about 11 weeks or so was typically about how the payroll calculation was done. And so that's why the 8 weeks always threw everybody off, because it did not align correctly with everything else that's out there. So that's another one that your money should theoretically, according to the lender, the way it was done right, that should last you that about 11 weeks at 2.5 months or so. A couple other questions quickly that we've gotten. I understand that an employer can choose either the 8-week or the 24-week period. If an employer chooses the 8-week period, do the other provisions of the PPP Flexibility Act apply? So the way that this law was written, there's a couple of different sections in here, Section 2 and Section 3, that do reapply as if it was written in the CARES Act. So the 60% and 40% that John mentioned earlier on the overview of the new law, that does apply even if you elect the 8 weeks or if you elect the 24 weeks. Regardless, the 60-40 split applies to whatever, any loan that's been originated under the 3P program, retroactive and moving forward. And then lastly, and I'll turn it over to John here on next steps, please keep in mind this, if you have not already applied for a loan, that June 30th is coming up. This is already the 12th. So the SBA cannot approve any loans after 11:59 p.m. on June 30th, meaning that your lender, everybody, you got to get your paperwork in well before then, so SBA can actually start approving it. So now next week is the time to get that done if you have not done so already. But John Mnuchin did say we need another bill, and a bipartisan bill at that, is what he said.
Yep. Moving forward, and quite honestly, and we'll touch on another slide, Secretary Mnuchin, the White House, and the Senate Republicans need to get their act together, because they're not all in alignment there. But Mnuchin did make it clear that he does believe another bill is necessary. But he wants to wait until all of the funds is part of the CARES Act and the various phases of the COVID-19 Relief Act have been dispersed. And so that is what is holding him back moving forward. He did indicate that moving forward, instead of blanket money going out the door to specific programs, he would like it targeted to certain industries. And he specifically mentioned the travel industry and the restaurant industry. And so I think there's a lot of discussion right now to further assist the restaurant industry and travel industry moving forward. So at that hearing, the Senate Small Business Committee and other hearings, Congress really wants Treasury to post the names of all those who received these COVID loans, whether it's over $2 million or not. The Treasury Secretary indicated at the hearing that those names are confidential and he would not be disclosing that list, but did throw a bone saying if the General Accounting Office, as part of their oversight responsibility, wanted to look at those names, he would do that in-house moving forward. So I'm not sure that's going to be satisfactory to the Democrats in the Congress, but Secretary Mnuchin has indicated that. So moving forward on what those next steps are and what are we looking for in some next phase of the COVID Relief Act would be an assurance that the deductibility of wages, mortgage interest, rent, and utilities will be allowed moving forward. And as I mentioned before, we're going to oppose any revenue test, for certification of need. We want to enhance the employee retention program. That has proved to be very popular for those who haven't taken advantage of the PPP program, but we want to tweak it and say even those who were eligible, who took advantage of the PPP loan program, would still be eligible for the employee retention tax credit. And finally, a very important point is to make sure that organizations, trade associations like NTMA and PMA, who are 501c6s, would be eligible for any future PPP loan program moving forward. So those are the asks that we are looking at moving forward on the next legislative action. But Omar, when do you think this is going to happen?
Yeah, it's a good question, John. I think the faulty job numbers from last Friday misled a lot of folks on the Hill that they didn't need to move as quickly as some folks are starting to realize that they do need to get there. And that's why, this top point that John mentioned on the deductibility of wages, rent, utilities as expenses, that's a really important one that could really take a large sizable chunk out of your PPP funds that you've received if you've got to pay taxes at a 21% or 37% rate on all of those issues that are normally treated as expenses. So yesterday, a quick update on that one as we look forward. Senator Cornyn of Texas tried to get it moving on unanimous consent. There were still a couple of Republican objections, so we weren't able to get it through yesterday, but we're very positive that it'll get done on the next bill. But I think, John, after 4th of July, probably sounds like with the timing for the next bill, we're going to expect a combination of things. Yes, there'll be the state and local issues that the Democrats get taken care of. Yes, there'll be legal liability protection. We signed on to, we're part of a coalition that just sent a letter. We should get that language on that bill next week on the liability protection. And then the other tranches that we're really focused on are incentives for manufacturing in America, whether it's reshoring incentives, onshoring incentives, and other business provisions. So on the tax side, there are a couple of things that are being floated around town. One of them allows basically an advance credit on all future taxes that would have been estimated and paid, and then you can adjust it in realignment if you don't end up incurring that same amount of taxes that you otherwise would have. You can adjust it at the end of the year. So there's a couple of things that are floating around town, particularly again on the onshoring, that would allow for additional expensing for labor, training, and equipment on which we're working. So we're pretty positive on that. Again, most likely we're looking at end of July. Our sense is that they'll do this right before the Senate leaves for their August recess. And so that way we're looking at sometime in mid or late July, I think, is when we get there, because right now the Senate Republicans are not all on the same page with the White House and the Treasury Department. So those folks, as John mentioned, need to align before negotiations really get started.
Not to get too far in the weeds, but just thinking of the calendar of what needs to get done. So the House passed a tweak on the TPP bill and took effect, as of June 5th, as we've talked about. But because of what has happened in this country the last 2 weeks, the House and Senate have to negotiate a police protection bill moving forward. There are 13 appropriations bills that, in theory, should be passed by at least one chamber before they leave for the August recess. And then you've got this new COVID, phase 4 of the stimulus package moving forward. So there's a lot on the plate right now of the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. But we are hopeful. I think if something falls through the hoops, I think it falls through the cracks. I think it'll be the appropriations bill. They will just do a continuing resolution to keep government funded and focus their attention on what that next stimulus bill is going to look like and some sort of police protection bill moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. But, we're still getting a lot of media inquiries with regards to how businesses are responding to this, I think.
Yeah, so on this slide, what you can see is if you were on the webinar, not the last time, we showed this infographic, which we had made based on the survey results that many of you participated in. And one of the benefits of making infographics is that they're very useful for media. So you can see here where the infographic was actually run as an article. And this is just to show you both that the interest in how on the ground manufacturers are using PPP loans and other federal government relief packages is very much of interest to media. In addition to this clip. And before I move on, let me just flag for you. If you are interested in this infographic and the data behind it, you can find it all on the One Voice social media account. It's also been shared by both associations. So if you're looking for that, you can find it there. Otherwise, of course, you can just email me and I can send you a copy. Other media inquiries, as Omar points out, we are getting lots of media inquiries still. Many thanks to many of you who are on today's webinar, who are doing interviews or have done them recently, set up a couple just the other day. So I know there's lots of folks doing them. If you're interested in talking to press or you think you have a story to share, please do always reach out to us. In addition to featuring all of your voices, every once in a while, we do share our own perspectives. Here is an op-ed published by the esteemed Paul Nathanson. It's in Snips magazine. You can find this story. It's a great piece that highlights not only how manufacturers are challenged by the response to the pandemic, but also shares some of the important stories that you guys all turned in about how PMA and NTMA members were responding, stepping up to assist people on the front line. So both sides of the story are in this op-ed, which you can find online.
And just a reminder that we're doing these webinars every other week, and on the off weeks we are putting up a new podcast, our Talking with One Voice podcast, that you can pull down wherever you hear your podcasts. That's Omar, John, Caitlin. Go out again is if you sought an exclusion on the Section 232 steel tariffs, and particularly if you were turned down, there is the Commerce Department is asking for comments. There's a public comment period, and if they're trying to see how the exclusion process is going, and if you're having problems, they need to hear from you. Feel free to contact one. They're really want to, it's an opportunity to make the exclusion process work better for all our members. So just contact one of us and we'll be talking, I'm sure we'll be talking about it on the podcast next week.
Yep, and then again, just a reminder that we did switch to bi-weekly with everyone's permission. So our next webinar will be on June 26th. I think by then, John and I will have a little better sense of where we might be in the legislative process with additional changes. In the interim, please keep checking the website that's out there. The biggest thing that we are all obviously waiting for, and we'll circulate it to all membership as soon as we get it, is the updated forgiveness application form. Right now is the time to start discussing whether or not you want to sit in the eight-week category or 24-week, and especially once we get a better sense of what the forgiveness term is. And then again, feel free to type in a question in the question box on the right. We're happy to answer anything we can today or take it back and respond back to you later. The only last one that I think we somewhat touched on, but it reiterates the need for guidance from the Treasury Department. The question is the safe harbor date only on December 31st or any date prior to December 31st? If we demonstrate we got there on July 31st on the employee headcount return, basically, is the question. And is that good enough even if we reduce after July 31st? You know, that's the biggest question that I personally have, and we emailed again a Hill staffer that wrote the bill this morning, and he got back to us saying it's his belief that your headcount return will be rather at the end of your either 8 or 24-week period. That being said, there are two places in the current application where it references your FTE count on June 30th. Then if you go down to page 11 in another area, there are two other places under the safe harbor provisions where it does not, it says by June 30th. It doesn't say on June 30th, whereas the application itself seems to imply, well, they want to know what your headcount was returned to on the date of June 30th. We would argue that, again, the intent wasn't that you keep them on all the way through then, it was that you return it by, so previously to before that date. So again, where people fall on that, we are in the third of it right now, minority that says, yes, you can technically lay off as many as you want after that June 30th deadline, or after your forgiveness deadline rather now. But 2/3 of the accountants and CPAs and lawyers that we talk to believe that you should go all the way to December 31st just to be safe and retain your employees. We think that's problematic. We're hoping we'll get clarification from the Department of Treasury here in the next week And John mentioned this already, but we are expecting a much simplified 1 or 2 page form for those of you that are under $2 million. So that should help you. The last 2 questions. Yes, can you get copies of these slides? Yes, I believe the slide deck is emailed out usually within a couple of hours afterwards. And also Caitlin will have posted onto the onevoiceinfo.org website where you can go and view all of these as well that are out there. And then lastly, do you expect clarification on, sorry, Caitlin. Lastly, do you expect clarification on transportation expenses? And that is also, yes, I think on transportation, we are hopeful we'll get some more. That one, and then the giving your employees additional technology equipment, such as telecommunications or helping subsidize their internet in any way, those kinds of questions have also come up. So yes, we're still looking for more clarification. We don't know if we're going to get it. We don't want to issue any promises. That one might remain vague for a little bit longer. But anyway, yes, we are hoping for that. And again, in the next week is our expectation for additional guidance because the forgiveness periods are coming up here on the 8 weeks are already up. If there aren't any other questions, thank you all for joining us. We'll talk to you in 2 weeks on June 26th. Thank you.